A marriage doesn't collapse in an earthquake. It fails by 1,000 tiny erosions. It's the leaky faucet you promise to fix but never do, the slow, imperceptible drift of foundations, the hairline cracks that spiderweb across the plaster until one day, you wake up and realize the entire structure is unsound. For 8 years, I thought the house Elena and I had built was solid. I was the architect, the builder, the man who checked the load-bearing walls. My restaurant was my blueprint for life, structured, predictable, built on the solid bedrock of routine and quality control. I knew my inventory, my staff, my profit margins. I thrived on the steady, reassuring rhythm of it all. Elena was the interior decorator. She was the one who threw open the windows and let the wild, chaotic winds of life blow through. She was an event planner, a creator of temporary magic, a whirlwind of color and energy and last-minute creative genius. When I first met her, I thought I had found the missing ingredient in my own carefully curated recipe for life. She was bold, confident, a Catherine Wheel of a woman who lit up every room she entered. Her spontaneity was the perfect counterbalance to my steadiness. We were, I told myself and everyone else, a perfect balance. Our life was the envy of our friends, a beautiful, harmonious structure everyone admired. Or so I thought. The erosion began so slowly, I didn't even notice the ground shifting beneath my feet. It was disguised as the normal settling of a long-term commitment. Work stress, long hours, the social obligations that came with her burgeoning career. I told myself it was normal for the initial, blazing fire of a relationship to settle into a comfortable, steady glow. We were 8 years in, after all. The mortgage was paid on time. The holidays were spent with family. The routine was intact. Everything was fine. But deep down, in the quiet, honest hours of the night when I'd lie awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, I couldn't ignore the nagging, persistent feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. It wasn't a loud alarm. It was a low, discordant hum beneath the surface of our lives, a note played consistently out of key. It started, as these things so often do, with the phone. A third party in our marriage, a sleek, black monolith that held secrets I wasn't privy to. It would buzz on her nightstand long after the lights were out, its screen casting a cool, blue, intimate glow on her face. She'd smile, a private, knowing little smile, and her thumbs would fly across the glass. "Who is it?" I'd ask, my voice thick with sleep. "Just work," she'd murmur, the words a familiar, flimsy shield. Coordinating with the team for the morning. I wanted to believe her. I chose to believe her. Because the alternative was a crack in the foundation I wasn't ready to inspect too closely. Then came the late nights. The texts would arrive around dinner time. Asterisk stuck at the office. Big project deadline. Don't wait up for me. Asterisk I'd eat alone. The silence of our big dining room, table a cavernous thing. I'd go to bed alone. The space beside me in our king-sized bed feeling vast and cold. She would slip in hours later, in the dead of night, moving with a quiet, practiced stealth. She'd smell of the city, of wine, and her perfume, which should have faded after a long day, would be unervingly fresh. Her explanations were always vague, wrapped in the impenetrable jargon of her industry. The client was being impossible. The venue had a last-minute crisis. They were plausible enough to accept, but they never quite settled right in my gut. The turning point, the moment the hairline cracks became impossible to ignore, was when her tone began to change. The easy, affectionate banter that had been the bedrock of our communication started to sour. It was replaced by a new sharpness, a critical edge that cut me in small, precise, almost unnoticeable ways. "Why don't you ever dress up for dinner anymore, Adrian?" she asked one night as I sat across from her in my usual uniform of a comfortable polo shirt and jeans. "You used to make an effort." "We're at home, Elena," I'd replied, confused. Who am I making an effort for? She'd just sighed and looked back at her phone. The critiques began to bleed into my professional life, the one area where I felt completely confident. "You could take more risks with your business," she'd suggest, swirling a glass of wine. "Maybe it would be more exciting." Exciting. Predictable. These words became her new weapons of choice. "You're just too predictable sometimes, Adrian." The words were designed to sting, and they did. But I absorbed them. I told myself this was a phase. Marriages go through rough patches. People grow, people change. But what I couldn't shake, what kept me awake at night, was the creeping, terrifying suspicion that she wasn't just critiquing me in a vacuum. She was comparing me. And the man on the other side of that comparison was a ghost, a faceless phantom I didn't know, but whose presence I was beginning to feel in every corner of our crumbling home. The family gathering at Sophie's house was supposed to be a ceasefire. Sophie, Elena's best friend since their chaotic college days, was the kind of person who could disarm a tense situation with a loud, infectious laugh and a tray of perfectly baked brie. Her family had always treated me as one of their own, their warmth a comforting balm. When Elena announced the event, a celebration of Sophie's parents' 40th wedding anniversary, I agreed to go, albeit with a sense of weary reluctance. Things between us had been a tightrope walk for weeks, and the idea of performing marital bliss for an audience was exhausting. Still, I held on to a sliver of hope that an evening surrounded by happy, uncomplicated people might ease the strain, might remind us of the couple we used to be. Elena, however, seemed unusually, almost manically, excited about the party. Her preparation was a full-scale military operation. She spent hours sifting through her wardrobe, holding up dresses to the mirror, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. She fussed over her makeup, her hair, her shoes. And her phone was a constant companion, buzzing and chiming as she scrolled, a small, secretive smile playing on her lips. "You'd think you were going to the Oscars," I teased, trying to inject some levity into the tense atmosphere of our bedroom. She shot me a look from the mirror, a complicated expression that was equal parts amusement and annoyance. "It's not just any party, Adrian. Sophie's family always goes all out. You should try to put in some effort, for once." The barb landed, as intended. I brushed it off, pulling my standard uniform from the closet, a clean button-down shirt, dark slacks. My effort clothes. I wasn't interested in dressing to impress people who had known me for nearly a decade. But her comment left a sour, metallic taste in my mouth. It wasn't a suggestion, it was another comparison, another judgment. When we arrived, the house was a warm, noisy hive of activity. The air smelled of roasting garlic and expensive perfume. Sophie's parents, radiant and beaming, greeted us at the door with hugs that felt like a lifeline. I forced a smile, scanning the familiar faces, trying to slip into the comfortable role of Adrian, the easygoing husband. But my eyes immediately found Elena. She wasn't looking at me. She was already gravitating toward a small, laughing group in the corner of the living room, moving with a sense of purpose, of magnetic pull. And in the center of that group, holding court like a minor king, was Eric. I already hated him. I'd met him a few times before, always at events Elena had planned, always in a professional capacity. He was tall, with the easy, athletic grace of a man who had never had an awkward day in his life. He was dressed in a tailored blazer that probably cost more than my weekly food budget for the restaurant, and he wore a smug, self-satisfied grin that seemed permanently affixed to his face. He was the kind of man who thrived on attention, who could charm the pants off a nun while simultaneously making every other man in the room feel like a dull, gray smudge. Tonight, he was in his element, and my wife, my beautiful, vibrant wife, seemed to be orbiting him like a moth drawn to a particularly dazzling and dangerous flame. As the evening unfolded, I tried to fight the sinking, sickening feeling in my chest. I made a conscious effort to engage. I chatted with Sophie's brother, Marcus, a laid-back architect who was always good for a cynical laugh. I caught up with some of the older guests, listening to stories about their grandkids and their golf scores. But my internal compass was broken, its needle constantly pulling my gaze back across the room to Elena and Eric. Every time I looked, it was another small, intimate tableau of betrayal. Her head tilted, listening intently to something he was saying. Her hand, resting for a fraction of a second too long on his arm as she laughed. The way she glowed under his attention, a radiant, high-wattage luminescence I hadn't seen directed at me in months, maybe years. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself this was just Elena being her charming, effervescent self. But the lies were thin, and the truth was a cold, hard stone in my gut. By the time dinner was served, I was wound as tight as a watch spring. We were seated at a long, boisterous table. I was on one side, engaged in a polite but agonizing conversation about property taxes with Sophie's uncle. Elena was on the other side, conveniently seated directly across from Eric. I watched them over the flickering candlelight, a spectator at the slow-motion demolition of my own marriage. At one point, Eric caught me staring. He didn't look away. He didn't have the grace to look guilty. Instead, his smug grin widened, and he raised his wine glass to me in a small, mocking toast. A silent acknowledgement. Asterisk, I see you watching me. And I don't care. Asterisk. In that moment, everything crystallized. This wasn't in my head. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was real. Something was happening between my wife and this man. And for the first time, I knew with a chilling, absolute certainty that I could no longer afford to pretend it wasn't. The foundation wasn't just cracked, it was crumbling. And the house was about to come down. Eric was a name before he was a person. A name that began to pepper Elena's post-work debriefings with an alarming frequency. At first, it was just a footnote. This new guy in marketing, Eric, he's got some interesting ideas. I'd nod, my mind on my own restaurant's inventory, and file the name away as another transient character in the sprawling drama of her professional life. But Eric was not transient. He was an invasive species, slowly but surely taking over the ecosystem of our conversations. Eric had this great idea for the gala, she'd say, her eyes alight with a professional excitement that seemed to have a personal edge. He's a genius at handling difficult clients. He just has this way with people. I brushed it off as admiration. Elena was passionate about her work. She respected talent. But as the months wore on, it became clear that her respect for Eric was bleeding outside the lines of professionalism. He wasn't just a colleague. He was an arbiter of taste, a source of amusement, a presence in her life even when he wasn't physically there. She'd come home from events he'd attended, still laughing at a joke he'd told hours earlier. I'd ask about her day, and somehow, the narrative would always circle back to him. The first time I met him in the flesh was at a company holiday party. He materialized beside us at the bar, all teeth and tailored charm. He knew exactly how to make a first impression, how to project an aura of effortless confidence. "You must be Adrian," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. His handshake was firm, a subtle, almost imperceptible squeeze of dominance. "Elena has told me so much about you." The words were polite, but the subtext was anything but. Asterisk, I know all about you. The predictable restaurant owner. The boring husband. Asterisk. Likewise, I replied, my tone deliberately cool. There was something in the way he looked at me, a swift, dismissive appraisal from head to toe. He was sizing me up, calculating my threat level, and, I suspected, finding it wanting. Throughout the night, I watched him work the room. People, especially women, gravitated toward him. He had a gravitational pull, a charisma that was as undeniable as it was, to me, repulsive. And then there was Elena, standing a little too close to his orbit, laughing a little too loudly at his anecdotes. It was as if I were a ghost at her side, my presence completely eclipsed by his dazzling light. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was insecure, threatened by this younger, flashier man. But deep down, in the part of my gut that had never lied to me, I knew. Eric wasn't just a harmless coworker. He was a predator, and he had marked his territory. After that party, the red flags, once subtle and intermittent, began to wave with frantic, undeniable urgency. The late nights at the office became a regular occurrence. The excuse was always the same. We're wrapping up the Henderson project. Eric's pushing everyone really hard, but it's going to be worth it. Her phone became a fortress I could not breach. It was always kept face down on the table. Notifications were swiped away with a speed and dexterity that spoke of long practice. If I walked into the room while she was texting, she would instinctively angle the screen away from me, her shoulders hunching in a posture of privacy that felt like a physical barrier between us. "Just work," she'd say, her voice tight, a preemptive strike against any questions I might ask. Then her appearance began to change. Elena had always been stylish, but now her style had a new, sharper edge. The dresses were a little tighter, the heels a little higher. She was dressing with a purpose, with a specific audience in mind, and I knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that audience was not me. When I'd compliment her, she'd offer a distant, distracted smile. "Thanks," she'd say, her eyes already scanning her phone for a message that was clearly more important than my opinion. The dinner party at Sophie's house, which should have been a neutral ground, became a battleground. The moment we arrived and I saw Eric in the corner, holding a glass of whiskey like he owned the place, I knew the night was already lost. He greeted Elena with a warm, familiar hug, his hands lingering on her waist for a beat too long. She laughed, a light, girlish sound I hadn't heard in ages, and playfully pushed him away. But she didn't step away. My stomach churned. When he turned to me, his smile was a mask of politeness. "Adrian," he said, extending a hand. "Good to see you." I shook it, my grip firm, my eyes cold. "Eric," I replied, my voice a flat, hard thing. For the rest of the evening, he was her shadow. They were a two-person island in the sea of the party, their conversation punctuated by shared whispers and private jokes. I felt like an intruder, a third wheel in my own marriage. At one point, as I stood by the fireplace, Marcus came over and stood beside me. He didn't look at me, but at them. "He's always been charming, hasn't he?" Marcus said, his voice a low murmur. I glanced at him, catching the knowing, almost pitying look in his eyes. "Is that what we're calling it?" Marcus smirked, a sad, cynical twist of his lips. "Let's just say he has a reputation for pushing boundaries." The comment hung in the air between us, a validation of every paranoid thought, every jealous suspicion I'd had for months. I wanted to ask for more, to demand details, but before I could, Sophie called us to the table. His words, however, stayed with me, a cold stone in my gut. As the evening wore on, my frustration simmered, threatening to boil over. I watched Eric dominate the conversation, basking in the attention, with Elena as his most rapt audience member. I could feel the tension coiling in my chest, a storm gathering force. I kept my composure, a tight, brittle mask of civility. But I knew this wasn't sustainable. He was crossing lines, and she was holding the door open for him. It wasn't just disrespectful. It was a profound, public humiliation. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I was done ignoring it. Something had to give, and it was going to give soon. The drive home after that first, deeply uncomfortable dinner at Sophie's was a masterclass in marital Cold War. The silence in the car was a weaponized thing, thick and heavy with unspoken accusations. Elena sat in the passenger seat, the blue-white glow of her phone illuminating her face, creating a stark, alien mask. She was humming softly to herself, a cheerful, tuneless sound that grated on my raw nerves. She was, quite clearly, in a fantastic mood. Meanwhile, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were bone white, my jaw clenched to the point of aching. The loop played in my head, relentless and unforgiving. Elena laughing, her hand brushing his arm, Eric's mocking toast. "You were quiet tonight," she said finally, her voice light, casual, as if she hadn't noticed the thunderclouds gathering in my eyes all evening. I risked a glance at her. "Just tired, I guess." My voice was steady, a miracle of self-control. She nodded, her attention already back on the glowing screen. She didn't press. She didn't want to know. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to pull the car over and demand to know what the hell was going on. But I didn't. Not yet. I was a strategist, a man who ran a business. I needed more data, more intelligence, before I launched an attack. I wasn't ready for the answer. Over the next few weeks, the data compiled itself with brutal efficiency. The red flags weren't just piling up, they were building a fortress around her, a fortress I was not allowed to enter. Her phone was the primary enemy combatant. It buzzed and chimed at all hours, a constant, intrusive soundtrack to our decaying marriage. If I walked into the room while she was mid-message, the phone would be flipped over, the screen locked, with a speed that was both impressive and damning. "Just work stuff, Adrian," she'd say with a bright, false laugh. You wouldn't find it exciting. One night, the mask of my composure slipped. She was in the shower, and her phone, left charging on the kitchen counter, lit up with a notification. I told myself not to look. I told myself it was an invasion of privacy, that I was better than this. I was not better than this. I walked over and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Eric. "That dress you wore today, stunning. Can't get it out of my head. Asterisk." A hot, acidic wave of rage and nausea washed over me. My hands were shaking. It wasn't just a flirty comment. It was possessive, It was intimate. It was a clear violation of a boundary that should have been sacred. When she came out of the bathroom, her hair wrapped in a towel, humming that same infuriatingly cheerful tune, I was waiting. I handed her the phone. Eric texted. I said, my voice dangerously calm. I watched her face, searching for a flicker of guilt, of panic. There was none. She unlocked the phone, read the message, and shrugged, a gesture of dismissive nonchalance. Oh, that's just Eric, she said, her voice breezy. You know how he is. He flirts with everyone. It doesn't mean anything. That's the problem, Elena, I said, my voice tight. I don't know how he is, but it's becoming abundantly clear how you are, and it means something to me. She sighed, a long, exasperated sound, and rolled her eyes. The eye roll was the most infuriating part. It was a complete and utter dismissal of my feelings, of my right to be hurt. Adrian, honestly, it's harmless. Harmless. Asterisk the word echoed in the sterile silence of our kitchen. Nothing about this felt harmless. Things escalated at the next social gathering, another casual dinner at Sophie's. I almost refused to go, but I knew my absence would be seen as a victory for him. So I went, my stomach in knots, feeling like a soldier marching into a battle I was already destined to lose. This time, he didn't even bother with subtlety. He arrived late, sauntering in with the easy confidence of a conquering hero, and made a beeline for Elena, bypassing everyone else. He was a heat-seeking missile, and she was his target. I tried to focus on other people. I talked to Marcus about a new building project he was excited about. I listened to Sophie's father tell the same fishing story he told at every party. But my gaze kept being pulled back to them. Eric, leaning in close, his hand resting on the back of her chair. Elena, laughing, her head tilted toward him, her hand lightly, almost unconsciously, resting on his shoulder. Marcus nudged me, his expression grim. You okay, man? Fine. I muttered, my clenched fists telling a different story. He didn't press, but his silent sympathy was both a comfort and an indictment. He saw it. Everyone saw it. The tipping point, the moment the Cold War turned hot, came during a group conversation in the living room. Sophie's father was recounting a genuinely funny story about a vacation mishap. The room was warm with laughter. And Eric, ever the opportunist, saw his moment. He cut in, his voice smooth and commanding. Well, all I know is that Adrian here must be the luckiest man alive. I mean, to be married to a woman as stunning and brilliant as Elena. He let the sentence hang in the air, a verbal grenade. The room went quiet for a beat. Someone coughed awkwardly. Elena, however, beamed. She positively glowed. Oh, Eric, she said, her voice a purr. You always know just what to say. My jaw tightened. The blood pounded in my ears. I forced myself to stay calm, to not give him the satisfaction of a public outburst. Yes, I said, my voice steady, but laced with ice. I am lucky. I met his gaze across the room, and I'd appreciate it if everyone remembered she's my wife. He raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, that infuriating grin plastered on his face. Relax, Adrian. Just a compliment. But it wasn't. It was a power play, a public assertion of his proximity to her, a challenge to my status as her husband. And it worked. The room's attention was now a laser beam focused on me, waiting for my next move. I didn't take the bait. Not then. The drive home was a tomb. The air was so thick with tension I could barely breathe. She kept glancing at me, her expression a cocktail of irritation and guilt. You didn't have to be so rude to Eric, she said finally, breaking the silence. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Rude? Are you serious? He was just being nice, she argued, her voice defensive. You're overreacting. Overreacting. I shot back, my voice finally breaking free of its restraint. He is systematically and publicly disrespecting our marriage, Elena. And you're not just letting him, you're encouraging him. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? Or do you just not care anymore? She didn't answer. She just turned her face to the window, watching the streetlights streak by. The silence that followed was her answer. That night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just happening to Elena. She wasn't some passive victim of his charm. She was an active participant. She was choosing to let this happen. She was choosing his validation over my dignity. And in doing so, she was crossing a line of her own. I didn't know how much more I could take, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this continue. Not without a fight. The night it all came crashing down started, as most disasters do, with an illusion of normalcy. Another dinner party at Sophie's house. By this point, attending these gatherings felt like a form of self-flagellation. I had become numb to the low-grade hum of anxiety that was now the permanent soundtrack of my life. The presence of Eric in our social circle was no longer a surprise. It was a given, a shadow that loomed over every conversation, every shared glance. But tonight, that shadow would finally acquire a substance so solid, so undeniable, that no one would be able to ignore it. We arrived, and the house was already a symphony of clinking glasses and easy laughter. Sophie, bless her heart, greeted us with her usual effusive warmth, either oblivious to or willfully ignoring the toxic cloud that followed us. Elena, like a compass needle finding north, immediately made her way to the kitchen, where Eric was already playing the role of charming co-host, pouring drinks, his laughter booming over the chatter. I stood in the entryway for a moment, a man untethered. I watched them through the doorway, the easy, familiar way they moved around each other. It was a choreographed dance, and I didn't know the steps. I felt like an outsider looking in, a guest at my own wife's life. I made my way to the living room, a refugee seeking neutral territory. Marcus saw me, and his face, usually a mask of wry amusement, held a flicker of something like pity. He handed me a glass of whiskey without a word, a silent gesture of solidarity. "Rough night already?" he asked, his voice low. I forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "You could say that." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You know you don't have to put up with this, man. People are starting to notice." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "What do you mean?" Marcus shrugged, taking a sip of his own drink. "Let's just say Eric has a reputation. And it's not for respecting boundaries. You're not the first husband to get that look on his face at one of these parties." His words were a gut punch. So I wasn't just paranoid. I was a cliché. The oblivious husband, the last to know. Before I could press him for more, Sophie clapped her hands, her voice bright and cheerful, calling everyone to the dining room. The meal began under a flag of truce. The conversation flowed, polite and pleasant. I did my best to participate, to focus on the people around me, but my attention was a frayed rope, constantly being pulled back to the other side of the table, to Elena and Eric. They were seated across from each other, a tableau of intimate conspiracy, a shared, knowing glance over a joke someone else told, an inside joke whispered behind a cupped hand. Every laugh she directed at him felt like a stone being thrown at the fragile glass house of my composure. Halfway through the main course, Eric decided it was time for the main event. He stood up, his wine glass held aloft, that infuriatingly confident smile plastered on his face. The room quieted, all eyes turning to him. "I just want to say," he began, his voice dripping with a practiced, cloying charisma, "how grateful I am to be here tonight, surrounded by such amazing, warm people." He paused, his gaze sweeping the table before it landed, with deliberate, theatrical weight, on Elena. "And how lucky we all are to know someone as truly special as Elena. She's one of a kind, a real force of nature." The room erupted in polite applause. Sophie beamed. Her parents nodded in agreement, and I felt the air leave my lungs. It wasn't a compliment. It was a claim, a public declaration of ownership. I looked at Elena, desperately searching her face for a flicker of discomfort, of embarrassment, of loyalty to me. I found none. She was smiling, a bright, radiant, basking smile. She was drinking it in. Something inside me, some carefully constructed dam of restraint I had been reinforcing for months, finally broke. As the applause died down, I set my own glass down on the table. The sound, a sharp, definitive clink, cut through the lingering chatter. The room went silent. Every head turned toward me. "You know, Eric," I said, my voice dangerously calm, dangerously steady. "It's truly amazing how comfortable you've made yourself. In someone else's life." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Elena's face went from radiant to aghast, the color draining from her cheeks. Eric's smile faltered, a flicker of genuine surprise in his eyes. He recovered quickly, attempting a nervous chuckle. "Whoa, relax, Adrian. It was just a toast." "No," I said, pushing my chair back and rising slowly to my feet. I felt strangely calm, my vision narrowed, my focus absolute. It's not just a toast. It's the culmination of months of inappropriate texts, of so-called late nights at the office, of boundary crossing and blatant, public disrespect. And I am done. I am done pretending I don't see it. Adrian, stop, Elena hissed, her voice a low, urgent plea. But I was a runaway train. I pointed a finger at Eric, my hand surprisingly steady. I see the way you look at her. I see the way you touch her. Do you really think I'm that much of a fool? Do you think I'm blind? Eric's smugness was gone now, replaced by a defensive sneer. You're being ridiculous, he said, his voice tight. Elena and I are just friends. Friends. I scoffed, a raw, ugly sound. Is that what friends do? Do they actively undermine a marriage? Do they flirt with a man's wife in front of his face? Do they push and push and push until there are no boundaries left at all? The tension in the room was a physical thing, a suffocating pressure. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, Eric stood up, knocking his chair back slightly. His arrogance gave way to pure indignation. You know what? Maybe the problem here isn't me. He spat, his voice sharp with venom. Maybe the problem is you. Maybe if you were enough of a man for her, she wouldn't need friends like me. That was it. That was the spark on the gasoline. The months of quiet humiliation, of feeling small and invisible in my own life, of being made to feel like the paranoid, jealous husband. It all coalesced into a single, white-hot point of rage. Before my conscious brain could register the decision, my body had already made it. I lunged across the corner of the table. The room exploded into chaos. Chairs scraped back. People shouted. Sophie screamed. It wasn't a clean punch. It was a messy, desperate, clumsy release of pure, undiluted fury. It wasn't just about Eric anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity. It was about refusing to be the butt of the joke, the quiet, accommodating husband who just stood by and watched his life be dismantled. By the time Marcus and Sophie's father pulled me off him, Eric was on the floor, a trickle of blood coming from his nose, his arrogant face a mask of shock and pain. The party was over. The whispers were hushed, urgent. Someone was on the phone, presumably calling for security, or the police, or an ambulance. I stood there, my chest heaving, my knuckles raw. I looked around the room, at the stunned, horrified faces. The laughter was gone. The charm was gone. The smug looks were gone. There was only the ugly, brutal, undeniable truth, laid bare on the dining room floor. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. The aftermath of a storm is a landscape of surreal calm. I walked out of Sophie's house into the cool, indifferent night air, leaving behind a tableau of chaos and shattered civility. My fists were still clenched, a dull throb in my knuckles mirroring the frantic, adrenalized pounding in my chest. Elena didn't follow me. I didn't look back to see if she would. In that moment, her presence or absence was irrelevant. All that mattered was the sudden, shocking clarity, the feeling of a pressure valve being released after being tightened for months. I didn't go home. Our house, the place that was supposed to be a sanctuary, felt like enemy territory. Instead, I drove on autopilot, the streetlights blurring into streaks of gold, and ended up at the one place that felt like a true refuge, my younger brother Liam's apartment. He opened the door in a rumpled t-shirt and sweatpants, his expression of sleepy confusion quickly morphing into alarm as he took in my state. Wild-eyed, breathing heavily, the front of my shirt spattered with a few drops of what was unmistakably Eric's blood. What the hell happened to you? He asked, stepping aside to let me in. Let's just say, I replied, my voice raspy, as I collapsed onto his worn-out leather sofa. I finally had enough. Eric won't be smirking for a while. Liam, to his credit, didn't bombard me with questions. He just disappeared into his kitchen and returned with 2 bottles of cold beer. He handed one to me and sat in the armchair opposite, a silent, patient sentinel, waiting for me to speak. And I did. For the next hour, the whole ugly story came pouring out of me. The late nights, the phone, the critical comments, Eric's insidious charm, the public humiliations, the slow, grinding erosion of my self-worth. It was a confession, an exorcism. By the time I finished, the beer in my hand was warm and untouched, and Liam's face was a hard mask of fury and concern. You should have come to me sooner, man, he said, his voice a low growl. This isn't something you should have been dealing with alone. I was embarrassed, I admitted, the words tasting like ash. I didn't want to admit my marriage was falling apart. I didn't want to believe it. Liam leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Adrian, this isn't just about your marriage anymore. This is about your self-respect. You cannot let people treat you like that. Not him, and especially not her. The days that followed were a blur of self-imposed exile. I stayed at Liam's, sleeping on his lumpy sofa, wearing his too big clothes. I turned my phone off. I needed the silence. Elena, I knew, would be calling, texting. Her messages would be a predictable cocktail of anger, blame shifting, and eventual, desperate pleas. I wasn't ready to hear any of it. When I finally turned my phone back on 2 days later, the barrage was exactly as I predicted. A dozen missed calls. A string of texts. How could you do that, Adrian? You humiliated me. Asterisk. Sophie's parents are furious. You've ruined everything. Asterisk. This is all your fault. You pushed me away. Asterisk. And then, the inevitable shift in tone. Please come home. We need to talk. Asterisk. I need to explain. It's not what you think. Asterisk. Adrian, I'm sorry. Please. Just call me. Asterisk. I deleted them all without replying. When I finally decided to go back to the house, it wasn't to reconcile. It was to confront. I needed answers, not excuses. I needed the truth, no matter how ugly. I returned on a Tuesday evening. The house was quiet, a single lamp glowing in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. She looked up as I walked in, a wave of desperate relief washing over her face. Adrian, she said, her voice soft, broken. Thank God you're here. We need to talk. Yeah, I said, shutting the door behind me with a definitive click. We do. The conversation that followed was the rawest, most honest one we had had in years. There were no social graces, no polite fictions. We just laid the wreckage out on the table between us. She admitted it. She admitted that her friendship with Eric had crossed a line, that it had become inappropriate. She swore it had never become physical, that it was just flirting, an emotional affair. But her words felt like a carefully curated version of the truth, designed to minimize her culpability. I didn't mean for any of it to happen, she said, tears streaming down her face. I was lonely, Adrian. We've been drifting apart for so long. And he made me feel seen. Seen? I repeated, the word a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. He made you feel seen? You think that justifies letting him humiliate me? Letting him disrespect our marriage in front of our friends, our family? Was that part of feeling seen, Elena? She shook her head, her hands trembling. No, of course not. I know I hurt you. I hate myself for it. But I didn't know how to stop it. My own voice rose, the last of my patience fraying. You could have chosen us. You could have chosen me. You could have put up a boundary, told him to back off, anything. But you didn't. You chose his attention. You chose him. Her silence was her confession. As the night wore on, as the accusations and tearful apologies circled each other in an exhausting dance, I realized something with a profound and chilling finality. It didn't matter what she said. The trust was gone. It had been pulverized into dust. A marriage without trust is just a contract, an empty house. I need space, I said finally, the fight going out of me, replaced by a vast, hollow weariness. I stood up. I can't do this right now. Adrian, please, she begged, reaching for my hand. Don't leave again. We can work through this. We can go to counseling. I'll do anything. I looked at her, at the woman I had loved for nearly a decade, and I felt a deep, sorrowful pity. But love wasn't enough to fix this. I shook my head. I don't know if there's anything left to work through. That night, I packed a bag. Not with anger, but with a quiet, grim resolve. As I walked out the door for the second time, I wasn't thinking about saving my marriage. I was thinking about saving myself. The road ahead was a terrifying, unknown territory. But for the first time, I felt like I was the one holding the map. And I knew one thing for sure. I was never going to let anyone, not even the woman I loved, make me feel small again. The quiet that followed my departure was different this time. It wasn't the charged, pre-storm silence of the past weeks. It was the vast, empty quiet of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. I was camped out at Liam's again, living out of a duffel bag, a refugee from my own life. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a dull, persistent ache that settled deep in my bones. Elena didn't bombard me with messages. Her absence on my phone was, in its own way, more unsettling than her pleas had been. It felt like a surrender, a white flag. It felt like she was finally grasping the finality of what had happened, and that realization, instead of bringing me relief, brought a fresh wave of grief. Liam, ever the pragmatist, gave me space but kept a watchful eye. One evening, as we sat on his back porch, the city lights a distant, indifferent glitter, he broke the silence. "So," he said, his tone casual but his eyes searching. "What's the plan, Ace?" I stared into the darkness. "Plan?" I let out a short, humorless laugh. "I don't have a plan. I can't seem to think past the next 5 minutes." I trusted her, Liam. For 8 years, she was the one person I thought I could trust implicitly. And now, I feel like I don't even know who she is. Liam nodded, taking a slow sip of his beer. "You know, trust isn't a one-time deposit. It's built over time, piece by piece. And when someone takes a sledgehammer to it, well, you can try to glue the pieces back together, but it's never going to be the same. The question is, do you even want to try?" I didn't have an answer. The thought of trying, of endless therapy sessions and trust-building exercises, felt exhausting, like being asked to run a marathon with 2 broken legs. The next day, I decided I needed clarity. Not from Elena, but about the man who had been the catalyst for this whole implosion. I called Marcus. We met at a nondescript coffee shop, a neutral ground far from our shared social circles. "Adrian," he said, his expression serious as he sat down. "I've been waiting for you to reach out." "What do you know, Marcus?" I asked, getting straight to the point. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Eric's not a good guy. He's charming. He's magnetic, but he's also a predator. He gets a thrill out of it. He specifically targets women in relationships. It's a game to him. He likes the challenge, likes seeing how far he can push things before it all blows up." My stomach twisted. "Does Sophie know this?" Marcus nodded grimly. "She knows. She's warned Elena about him before. But, well, it seems like Elena didn't want to listen." The weight of his words was crushing. Elena hadn't just been naive. She had been willfully blind. She had been warned. Fueled by a fresh wave of cold, clarifying anger, I made a decision. I needed to confront him. Not to fight, not to scream, but to look him in the eye and see the man who had so casually detonated my life. I showed up at his sleek, downtown office unannounced. The receptionist, a young woman with a startled expression, tried to stop me, but I brushed past her and walked straight to his glass-walled office. He was sitting at his desk, feet propped up, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, his smug composure faltered. "Adrian," he said, his voice a smooth, calculated recovery as he lowered his feet. "What a pleasant surprise. Cut the crap, Eric. You know why I'm here." He leaned back in his chair, the smirk returning. "I assume this has something to do with the overly dramatic events of the other night. Look, man, I get it. It's tough when another man can offer your wife the excitement you can't. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it was breathtaking. You think this is a game?" I growled, taking a step closer to his desk. "You think you can just waltz into someone's life, poison their marriage, and walk away without a scratch?" He stood up, his smirk hardening into a defensive sneer. "I didn't destroy anything, pal. If your marriage was so rock solid, she wouldn't have been looking for a way out. I was just the door that happened to be open." The words were a scalpel, cutting deep and true. But they also ignited my resolve. "You're a coward, Eric," I said, my voice low and steady. "You hide behind your charm and your money, tearing other people down to make yourself feel powerful. But you're empty. There's nothing there." For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely thrown. His face flushed with anger. Before he could respond, a burly security guard, summoned by the panicked receptionist, appeared in the doorway. "Sir," the guard said, his voice a firm rumble, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I took a step back, my eyes still locked on Eric. "This isn't over," I said, my voice a cold promise. As I walked out of that office building and back into the anonymous bustle of the city, I felt a strange sense of release. I hadn't won. I hadn't gotten an apology, but I had stood my ground. I had spoken my truth. He thought he had all the power, but he was wrong. I wasn't done fighting. Not for my marriage, but for my dignity, and for my future. The confrontation with Eric, as unsatisfying as it was, marked a turning point. The storm had passed, but the air was still charged, the aftermath a landscape of debris and uncertainty. I had drawn a line in the sand, but I knew Eric wasn't the type to let a challenge go unanswered. The first tremor of the aftershock came 2 days later. Elena showed up at Liam's house, unannounced and uninvited. Liam answered the door, his 6 feet 2 inches frame a formidable barrier. I heard his low, annoyed voice before I saw her standing on the welcome mat, looking pale and drawn. "Adrian," she said softly, her voice shaky, as I came to the door. "Can we please talk?" Liam gave me a look that said, "Are you sure about this?" I nodded. It was time. We stood on the small porch, the cool evening air a stark contrast to the heat of my still simmering anger. Elena wouldn't meet my eyes. "I heard about what happened," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "At Eric's office." I leaned against the railing, my arms crossed. "And," she sighed, a sound heavy with exhaustion. "Adrian, this has to stop. This anger, this crusade. It's not going to fix anything." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "You're going to lecture me about fixing things? Now, after everything?" Her eyes flashed with a familiar flicker of defensiveness, but it was quickly replaced by guilt. "I know I made mistakes. Horrible mistakes. I know I hurt you. But this isn't just about us anymore. Eric, he's threatening to escalate things." That got my attention. "Escalate how?" "He's talking about filing a restraining order against you," she said, her voice dropping. "For harassment. And he's considering suing you for assault from that night." My fists clenched at my sides. The audacity of the man was boundless. "Let him try. I'll countersue for intentional infliction of emotional distress. I'll bring in every piece of evidence, every witness. Let's see how he likes having his private life dissected in a deposition." "Adrian, please," she said, stepping closer, her voice taking on a desperate edge. "I don't want this to get any uglier than it already is. For both our sakes. Please, just let it go." Her words hung in the air, a plea for a truce I wasn't sure I was capable of giving. The thought of letting Eric walk away unscathed was nauseating. But the thought of a protracted, ugly legal battle, of dragging our friends and our private pain through the mud, it was exhausting. "I'll think about it," I said finally, my voice flat. "But don't mistake my silence for forgiveness, Elena. We are far from done." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. I'm sorry, Adrian. For everything." I didn't respond. I just turned and walked back into the house, leaving her alone on the porch. "He's threatening legal action?" Liam asked, his eyebrows raised in disbelief as I collapsed onto the couch. "Yeah. And she wants me to back down. To just let him win." Liam frowned. "And are you going to?" "I don't know," I said, rubbing my temples. I'm so tired of fighting Liam. But the thought of him getting away with it. I spent the next few days in a state of limbo, the anger warring with a profound sense of weariness. I threw myself into my restaurant, the familiar, comforting rhythms of the kitchen a welcome distraction. I reconnected with suppliers, reworked the menu, lost myself in the tangible, solvable problems of my business. And then, just as I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, Elena was right, that letting go was the only path to peace, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Is this Adrian?" a woman's voice asked, hesitant. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Vanessa. I'm a colleague of Elena's. And Eric's." My heart sank. "What is this about?" "I think you need to know something," she said, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "It's about Eric. He's been spreading rumors about you at the office. He's telling everyone that you're unstable, violent. He's twisting the story to make you look like the villain." I gripped the phone, my pulse quickening. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it's not true," she said firmly. "And because I don't think Elena knows how far he's taking this. He's trying to destroy your reputation. You deserve to know what you're really up against." Her words were a lightning strike, illuminating the dark landscape of Eric's manipulations. This wasn't about him being scared or defensive. This was a calculated, offensive strike. He was trying to ruin me. And in that moment, I knew. Letting go wasn't an option. But this time, I wasn't going to fight with my fists. I was going to fight with the truth. And I was going to play the long game. Vanessa's phone call was the catalyst. It shifted my perspective from defense to offense, from personal grievance to a strategic campaign. Eric wasn't just a homewrecker. He was a bully who used his position and charisma as weapons, and he had underestimated his target. He thought I was just a predictable, broken-hearted husband. He was about to find out I was also a meticulous, patient, and deeply underestimated adversary. The next morning, I called Vanessa back. "I need to know everything," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "Every rumor, every lie, every person he's spoken to." Vanessa, her voice now firm with resolve, laid it all out. Eric was painting a masterpiece of character assassination. He was telling people I'd been harassing them for months, that I was a jealous, controlling husband, that the fight at Sophie's party was an unprovoked attack. He was spinning a narrative where he was the victim, and Elena was the damsel he was trying to protect from her unstable spouse. "Why are you risking so much to help me?" I asked, genuinely humbled by her courage. "Because I'm tired of it," she said, a hard edge to her voice. "He's been getting away with this kind of behavior for years. The rumors, the inappropriate comments, the way he preys on women in the office. Everyone knows, but everyone's too afraid of him to say anything." I thought, maybe you weren't afraid. Her words lit a fire in me. This was bigger than me now. This was about justice. The first step was to build a case. I went back through every text, every email, every memory, and began to construct a detailed timeline. Elena's late nights, the trip to Philadelphia, the flirty messages she'd once so carelessly left open on her phone. Each piece was a brick in the wall of evidence I was building against him. But I needed more than my own story. I reached out to Marcus again. He was hesitant, worried about dragging Sophie and his family into the mess. "Marcus, I'm not asking you to testify in court," I said. "I'm asking you to help me find other people he's hurt. Vanessa says I'm not the first. There have to be others who are willing to speak up if they know they're not alone." Reluctantly, he agreed to discreetly ask around. Over the next few weeks, my phone began to ring. The calls were from former employees, other colleagues, women who had their own stories of Eric's manipulation, his boundary pushing, his outright harassment. Some were too scared to go on the record, but a few, emboldened by the knowledge that they were part of a pattern, agreed to provide anonymous statements. A picture began to emerge of a serial predator, a man who had been protected for years by a corporate culture that valued profits over people. All the while, Elena had no idea what I was doing. We had minimal contact, our communication limited to sterile text messages about logistics and the impending divorce proceedings. She called once, her tone softer, almost pleading. "Adrian, I know you're still hurt," she said, "but you can't let this vendetta consume you. You're better than this." "Maybe," I replied, my voice cold. "But I'm also tired of being the guy who just lets things slide." Finally, after weeks of quiet, relentless work, I was ready. I scheduled a meeting with the head of human resources at Eric's company, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense woman named Claire Thompson. I didn't go alone. Vanessa and Marcus came with me, a silent, powerful show of solidarity. I walked into that sterile conference room armed not with anger, but with a thick file folder. I laid it all out for Claire, the timeline, the screenshots, the anonymous, notarized statements from other women. I spoke calmly, factually, presenting my case not as a scorned husband, but as a concerned party exposing a dangerous liability within her company. As she read through the file, her expression shifted from professional skepticism to visible shock, and then to a slow-burning anger. "This is significant," she said, her voice tight, as she closed the folder. "If even half of this is true, it represents a catastrophic failure on our part." "It's all true," I said firmly. "And I'm not here asking for revenge. I'm asking for accountability." Claire Thompson looked at me, then at Vanessa and Marcus, who both nodded in confirmation. Her jaw was set. "You'll have it," she said. The weeks that followed were a quiet storm within the walls of Eric's company. An internal investigation was launched. Eric was suspended, his smug confidence reportedly replaced by a thinly veiled panic. Elena called me one last time during that period. Her voice was a whisper. "I heard about what you did," she said. "The HR meeting. I didn't think you had it in you." "This was never about you, Elena," I replied, the words feeling true for the first time. This was about him, and it was about me finally standing up for myself. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control. I wasn't just a victim of circumstance anymore. I was the architect of my own justice. The final outcome was still uncertain, but my part in it was done. I had laid the truth out for the world to see. Now, it was time to let it do its work. The denouement was swift and decisive. Eric, faced with a mountain of corroborated evidence and the prospect of a massive, publicly humiliating lawsuit, was given a choice: resign immediately or be fired for gross misconduct. He chose to resign. His reign of charismatic terror was over. The news came to me not through a dramatic phone call, but a quiet, almost anticlimactic email from Claire Thompson at HR, thanking me for my courage in coming forward. It was a strange feeling. There was a sense of vindication, yes, but it was muted, tempered by a profound exhaustion. I hadn't destroyed a monster in a glorious battle. I had simply exposed a petty, manipulative man and watched his house of cards collapse under the weight of his own actions. Elena called me the day the news became official. Her voice was small, fragile. "He's gone," she said. "I know." There was a long pause, filled with the static of 8 years of shared history. "Adrian," she began, her voice cracking. "You were right. About everything. About him and about me. I let it happen. I was weak, and I was selfish, and I hurt you in ways I can never take back. I'm so sorry." The apology, when it finally came, felt like a ghost. It was the words I had desperately wanted to hear months ago, but now they seemed to belong to another lifetime, to another man. "I appreciate that, Elena," I said, my voice measured, devoid of anger. "But it doesn't change anything. It doesn't rebuild the trust you shattered." "I know," she whispered. After that call, a sense of closure, real and final, began to settle over me. This wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about him. It was about me and the quiet, empty space ahead of me that I now had to fill. The divorce was finalized without drama. We sold the house, that beautiful structure with the compromised foundations, and divided the proceeds. The last time I saw her was across a lawyer's table as we signed the final papers. We didn't speak. We just exchanged a brief, sad, acknowledging nod, two strangers who had once known every secret of each other's hearts. Over the next few months, I focused on the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding. I poured my energy back into my restaurant, and it thrived. The structure and routine that Elena had once called predictable became my salvation. I reconnected with Liam, with Marcus, with friends I had neglected. I learned to enjoy the quiet, to find solace in my own company. The scars were still there, faint, silvery lines on the landscape of my life. But they no longer ached. They were just a reminder of a storm I had weathered. Months later, long after the dust had settled, Liam dragged me on a weekend hiking trip with a local outdoor group. I went reluctantly, still wary of new people, of small talk. As we gathered at the trailhead, a woman with a warm, easy smile and kind, intelligent eyes introduced herself. "Hi, I'm Claire," she said. Throughout the hike, we fell into an easy rhythm, talking about books, about travel, about our ridiculous dogs. She was a middle school history teacher, and she spoke about her students with a passion and dedication that was both grounding and inspiring. There was no artifice to her, no hidden agenda. She was just real. I realized, somewhere around the 3rd mile, that I hadn't thought about Elena or Eric once. I was just a man on a mountain, talking to a woman, feeling the sun on my face. It wasn't a lightning bolt. It wasn't a whirlwind. Our relationship, as it began to grow in the weeks that followed, was a slow, steady construction, built on a new foundation of honesty and mutual respect. One evening, as we sat on the small balcony of my new apartment, watching the city lights begin to twinkle below, she turned to me. "You've been through something," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet observation. "It didn't break you, though. It made you stronger." Her words stayed with me long after she had gone. She was right. The fire had burned down the old house, but in the ashes, I had found the materials to build something new. Something smaller, perhaps, and less grand. But it was solid. The foundation was sound, and it was mine. I looked out over the city, at the endless constellation of lights, each one a story, a life. My own story wasn't a fairy tale. It had no perfect, happy ending. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt like my own. And that was more than enough. It was everything.